There is a strange beauty to be found in the silk-smooth darkness of a story well told. Step into our world of shadows and light, where every secret is a thread in a much larger tapestry. Subscribe now and help us unravel the mystery together.
Trunk, hic, kia, fikifile tim, hekifile tim, hato, izem, lugatan sublu, ekatan, sachkisem, temptisho, shintron, Harold, Diane, Patrick, Marcus, Nathan, Bernard, Gloria, Lorraine, Lawrence, Vanessa, Adele, Helen, Jeffrey, Renee, Dorothy, Margaret, Kevin, Sandra, Patricia, Elaine, Trevor, Simone, Gerald, Irene, Philip, Renata, Corinne, Winifred, Thomas, Fiona, Derek, Amber, Claudette, Temahitoi Sungui Dung, Miriam, Unfanhaka Kam, Egai 684 Tuive, Paine, Rochelle, Kangai, Dwayne, Twain Haboing, Going, Shaofeng, Rochelle, Adet, Mahapu Dwayne, Franklin, the Hayud Cat, Feng Fu, ivory linen with a thin gold border. I'd driven 40 minutes to a fabric shop in Savannah because the ones at the local store looked cheap, and I told myself that a house worth keeping deserved curtains worth hanging. I stood at the edge of the driveway with my rolling suitcase beside me, and I stared at those curtains, and something in my chest went very quiet. They were gray now, not silver, gray. The kind of gray that comes from years of not being washed, of sun-hitting fabric that nobody thought to protect. One panel hung lower than the other, like the rod had bent, and nobody had bothered to fix it. I stood there for a long moment. The August heat pressed down on my shoulders. My flight from Toronto had landed 3 hours late, and I hadn't slept in almost 2 days, and my knees ached from the long walk through Hartsfield-Jackson. But I didn't move toward the door yet. I just looked at those curtains, and I tried to remember the last time Rochelle had sent me a photo of the inside of the house. I couldn't remember. That was the answer. I couldn't remember because she hadn't. I should tell you something about why I left, because I know that's the first thing people wonder. 12 years is a long time. I know how it sounds, but when my sister Bernadette was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's in 2013, she was 51 years old and living alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Mississauga, with no one to help her. Our mother was gone. Our father had been gone since we were girls. There was me, and there was Bernadette, and there was nobody else. Rochelle was 24 when I left. She wasn't a child. She had a degree in business administration from Georgia State. She had her health, her mind, her whole life ahead of her. And she had the house, a 4-bedroom colonial in Brookhaven that I paid off the mortgage on the year before I left. I put it in her name. I wanted her to have something solid, something that couldn't be taken from her, something that would always be there no matter what happened to me. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought giving her the house was the responsible thing. I was wrong about a lot of things. For the first 3 years, Rochelle and I talked every Sunday. Video calls, sometimes an hour long. She told me about her job at the marketing firm downtown, about the friends she'd made, about a man she'd started seeing named Dwayne. She seemed happy. She seemed like herself. I would hang up the phone and go back to Bernadette's apartment feeling like I was doing 2 things right at once, taking care of my sister and watching my daughter build her life. Then Rochelle married Dwayne in the spring of 2016, and the Sunday calls became every other Sunday. I told myself that was normal. She had a husband now. She had a life. Then every other Sunday became once a month. Then once a month became a text here and there, short answers. I'm fine, Mom, just busy. I tried calling. Sometimes she picked up, sometimes she didn't. When she did, she sounded distracted, like she was half listening to something else in the room. Once I heard a man's voice in the background say something sharp, and Rochelle said, "I have to go," and hung up. I asked her about it in a text the next day. She said it was nothing. She said Dwayne was just stressed about work. By 2020, I was lucky to hear from her twice a year. I want you to understand, I tried. I called. I texted. I sent cards for her birthday and Christmas. One year, I wired her money as a gift and she sent back a thank you message that was 3 sentences long and read like something you'd write to a distant acquaintance. I told myself she was busy. I told myself she was happy and just bad at keeping in touch. I told myself a lot of things. Bernadette passed away in November of 2024, peacefully in the end, in the room we'd set up for her in the house I'd been renting in Mississauga. I held her hand. I had been holding it for most of 3 days. After the funeral, after the paperwork, after the silence settled into the house like weather, I sat down at my kitchen table and looked at my phone. I hadn't spoken to Rochelle in 4 months. I called her. It rang 7 times and went to voicemail. I left a message telling her that her Aunt Bernadette was gone, that I was coming home, that I would be at the house in Brookhaven by the end of February. She didn't call back. I came anyway. I stood in the driveway on a Tuesday morning in late February with my suitcase and looked at my gray curtains, and I rang the doorbell. A woman answered the door. She was somewhere in her mid-60s, heavy-set with processed hair pulled back tight and a house dress that looked like it had been slept in. She looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite annoyance. It was something in between, territorial. I said, "I'm looking for Rochelle." She said, "She's in the back." And then she didn't move. I said, "I'm her mother." Something shifted in the woman's face. Not softened, recalibrated, like a person adjusting their position before a conversation they'd been prepared for. She stepped back and let me in. The inside of my house didn't look like my house anymore. The furniture in the living room was wrong. Heavy, dark pieces I didn't recognize, crowding the space in a way that felt aggressive. My grandmother's side table, the one with the inlaid wood pattern, was gone. A large flat-screen television I'd never bought dominated the wall where I'd once hung a landscape painting. The floors looked like they hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The woman told me her name was Odette. She said she was Dwayne's mother. She said this with the kind of deliberate casualness that people use when they want you to ask follow-up questions so they can control the answers. I didn't ask. I said, "Where is Rochelle?" She pointed down the hallway toward the kitchen. I found my daughter standing at the sink, washing dishes. She was wearing clothes that were too big for her, sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, and her hair, which she'd always kept natural and neat, was pulled back with a rubber band. She was thin, thinner than I'd ever seen her, and she was moving with a kind of careful slowness, the way people move when they've learned to make themselves small. She turned around when she heard me come in, and her face went to 4 different expressions in about 2 seconds. Shock, something that might have been joy, then something that looked like fear, then a careful, flat nothing. She said, "Mom." I said, "Hi, baby." And then I just stood there and looked at her, and she stood there and looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Later, much later, I would think about that moment and understand what I was seeing. I was seeing a person who had learned not to show anything in front of an audience, because Odette had followed me down the hallway and was standing in the kitchen doorway, and my daughter knew that. I asked Rochelle if she'd show me around the house. She looked at Odette before she answered me. That look told me everything. I kept my face neutral. I said, "It's okay. I'll look around myself. I know where everything is." Odette said, "Some things have changed." I said, "I can see that." I walked through my house room by room, slowly, while Odette followed me at a distance, and Rochelle stayed in the kitchen. The dining room had been converted into what looked like an office for Dwayne. His name was on a few pieces of opened mail I saw on the desk. The guest bedroom where I used to keep my sewing things was now clearly Odette's room. Personal items, clothes, photographs of people I didn't know. The master bedroom was Dwayne and Rochelle's, at least nominally, but when I glanced in, I noticed that one side of the bed was clearly used and one side was not. I went upstairs. The smallest bedroom, which had always been a catch-all room for storage, and eventually a reading room I'd set up with a daybed and bookshelves, had been stripped. The bookshelves were gone. The nice daybed was gone. There was a narrow cot pushed against one wall, and a folding chair and a small box fan. A few pieces of Rochelle's clothing hung on a rod that had been screwed directly into the wall. This was where my daughter was sleeping, in her own house, in the smallest room, on a cot. I stood in that room for a long moment, and I breathed very carefully, the way you breathe when you are in a situation where you understand that losing your composure right now will make things worse, not better. Then I went back downstairs. Dwayne came home around 6 that evening. He was a large man, confident in the way that some men are confident when they've been unchallenged for a long time. He came through the door, saw me standing in the living room, and had the decency to look briefly unsettled before he collected himself and extended his hand. He said it was good to meet me. He said Rochelle had mentioned I might be visiting. He said visiting with a very particular emphasis. I shook his hand. I told him it was good to meet him too. Over dinner, which Rochelle cooked while Odette sat at the kitchen table and directed. I watched them. The way Dwayne spoke over Rochelle when she tried to answer a question I'd asked her. The way Odette corrected the way Rochelle had seasoned something. The way my daughter ate her food with her eyes on her plate. The way she reached for the salt and then didn't, like she'd remembered something and changed her mind. After dinner, while Odette and Dwayne watched television in the living room, I helped Rochelle wash the dishes. I turned the water up a little for cover, and I said quietly, "How long has she been living here?" Rochelle kept her eyes on the dishes. She said 3 years. I said, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, "I'm fine, Mom." I said, "That's not what I asked." She was quiet again. Then she said, very low, almost nothing, "Please don't make it worse." I didn't push. Not that night. I slept in the master bedroom. I announced this pleasantly and without asking permission, and watched Dwayne's jaw tighten, and said nothing further about it. In the middle of the night, I lay in the dark and made a list in my head. The missing furniture. The mail with only Dwayne's name on it. The way Rochelle looked before she answered a question directed at me. The room upstairs. The cot. The next morning, I called my attorney, a man named Franklin who I'd worked with for years when I was still managing properties in Atlanta. A sharp and methodical man who I knew could be trusted. I told him I was back in Atlanta and that I needed to talk to him as soon as possible. He asked if it was urgent. I said, "I need you to pull the deed on my property in Brookhaven. I need to see whose name is on it." There was a short pause. Then he said he'd call me back within the hour. He called back in 40 minutes. The house was in Dwayne's name. Not Rochelle's. Dwayne's. The transfer had been recorded 2 years ago. I sat in the car in the parking lot of a coffee shop 3 blocks from the house, and I was very quiet for a minute. Just quiet. Then I said, "Franklin, I need everything. The full chain of title. I need to know how that transfer happened, and I need to know what it looked like on paper." He said he'd get it. Over the next week, I moved carefully. I stayed in the house. I was pleasant at meals. I asked Dwayne questions about his work, and I listened to his answers, and I watched him relax incrementally like a man who has decided he doesn't need to worry about something anymore. I watched Odette watch me, and I gave her nothing useful to see, and in the evenings, when they were settled in front of the television, I sat at the kitchen table with Rochelle, and I talked to her slowly, carefully, like you talk to someone who has been somewhere very cold for a long time, and needs to warm up gradually. It took 4 evenings before she told me what had happened. In 2021, Rochelle had gotten sick. A respiratory infection that turned serious, turned into pneumonia, put her in the hospital for 8 days. She'd been weak and frightened, and Dwayne had been there, solicitous and attentive in the way he apparently knew how to be when it served him. And while she was still on oxygen and couldn't sit up without help, he brought papers to the hospital. He said it was a financial protection document. He said her name needed to be off the property temporarily for insurance purposes, something to do with a claim she didn't fully understand. She trusted him. She signed. By the time she was well enough to ask questions, the deed had recorded, and Dwayne had a different answer ready for every question she raised. And then the questions started to cost her things: a withdrawn kindness, a comment at dinner, a door closed too hard. Until she learned, the way people learn these things, that asking questions wasn't worth what it took out of her. I sat with all of that for a moment. Then I said, "Did you ever see the document? Did you keep a copy?" She said no. I said, "Did anyone witness the signing?" She thought. She said a nurse came in while I was signing. I think she saw. I said, "Can you remember which hospital?" She looked at me for a long moment, like she was trying to decide whether to believe that something could actually be done. Like she'd stopped believing that anything could be done such a long time ago that the idea of it had become unfamiliar. Then she told me the hospital. Franklin moved fast when he had something to move on. The hospital's records confirmed the admission date. We tracked down the nurse through the hospital staffing records. She was still working the same floor, and she remembered the visit. She remembered because something had struck her as wrong. A man bringing papers to a woman on oxygen. She hadn't said anything at the time. She said she wished she had. She said it when it counted. The document Rochelle had signed was not what Dwayne had told her it was. There was no insurance claim, no financial protection filing. It was a straight transfer of title, and the signature on the notarization was not from a licensed notary on duty at the hospital that day. Franklin contacted the district attorney's office. I called Rochelle into the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon while Dwayne was at work and Odette was watching her program in the living room. I sat down across from her at the table that had been in this kitchen for 20 years. The table where she'd done homework as a girl and eaten birthday cake and learned to make her grandmother's cornbread recipe, and I laid it out for her simply. What we'd found, what it meant, what was going to happen next. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What about her?" Meaning Odette. I said, "Franklin is looking at the financial records. We'll know more soon." The financial records showed that Odette had been receiving a monthly transfer from a joint account that Dwayne had opened in his and Rochelle's names, without Rochelle's knowledge, using Rochelle's information. The account had been funded by rental income from her property, a duplex in Decatur, that I had given Rochelle as an investment property when I left, that had somehow ended up in Dwayne's name 6 months after the house transfer, through a similar process involving a document Rochelle had no memory of signing. The DA's office opened the investigation on a Friday. They arrested Dwayne the following Tuesday. Odette was taken in the same morning on separate charges related to the financial transfers. I was standing in the kitchen when the detective called me to say it was done. Rochelle was at the table. She heard my side of the conversation, and she watched my face. And when I hung up the phone and told her, she didn't cry right away. She just sat very still. The way you sit when you've been braced against something for so long that when it stops, your whole body doesn't know what to do with the absence of pressure. Then she put her head down on the table, and she cried for about 20 minutes. I sat next to her with my hand on her back, and I let her. There's a thing I didn't expect after all of it. I expected to feel righteous or relieved or satisfied in some clean and uncomplicated way. I did feel those things, but mostly what I felt was tired and sad and full of the specific grief that comes from looking at your child and knowing that hard years have lived in her face. Years that you were not there for. I carry that. I will always carry it. Leaving was the right thing for Bernadette. I know that. I also know it left a door open that should have been better guarded, and I was not there to guard it, and my daughter paid for that in ways that are not fully recoverable. We talked about it, Rochelle and I, not in one conversation. You don't cover 12 years in one conversation. We covered it slowly over evenings, over kitchen table suppers, over long walks in the neighborhood. She told me what the years had looked like from the inside. I told her what they'd look like from the outside. Neither view was complete. Neither of us had the whole picture until we compared notes. She asked me once why I hadn't come sooner, when the calls got shorter, when the texts got fewer. I told her the truth, because she'd told me she was fine. Because I'd believed her. Because I'd wanted to believe her. Because it was easier, from that distance, to choose the explanation that let me think I hadn't made a mistake. She nodded. She said, "I know. I told you I was fine because I was ashamed. And because he always said no one would believe me anyway." That sentence hit me somewhere I'm still not done feeling. The case went to trial 8 months later. Dwayne was convicted on 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of elder financial abuse for the transfers made using Rochelle's information. He was sentenced to 6 years. His attorneys said they would appeal. Odette pled out. 2 years plus full restitution of the funds she'd received. The house came back to Rochelle through the court's judgment. The duplex in Decatur came back too. The day the paperwork came through, I drove to the house with a bottle of sparkling apple cider. Neither of us drinks much, and Rochelle was standing in the front door when I pulled up. She'd gotten a haircut, a real one. Short and neat and intentional. She looked like herself. She looked like the person I'd been missing without being able to name exactly what was missing. We sat on the front porch and we drank the cider out of the good glasses she'd found in the back of the cabinet, the crystal ones I'd bought years before that had somehow survived everything. And the evening came in slow and warm, and the neighbors across the street were grilling something that smelled like summer, and my daughter sat beside me in her own house, on her own porch, and she laughed at something I said. Not a polite laugh. A real one. The kind that starts in the stomach. I had not heard that laugh in 12 years. I'd forgotten what it sounded like. 6 months after that, Rochelle started a consulting practice out of the house, helping small businesses with marketing and branding, doing what she'd been trained to do. She has 3 clients now and is talking to a 4th. She takes her time. She does things carefully and on her own terms. She checks in with me twice a week, not because I ask her to, but because she wants to. Last Sunday, she called me while she was on the front porch. She planted things in the window boxes. I could see them on the video call, small and green and new. She'd taken down the gray curtains and found, at a fabric shop about 20 minutes away, ivory linen ones with a thin gold border. She said, "I know you're going to say you don't need it." I said, "I don't need it." She said, "I wanted to anyway." I looked at those curtains, new and clean, and I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "They look beautiful, baby." She smiled. "I know." I've thought a lot about the word fine since all of this happened. How much weight it carries. How much it hides. Rochelle said she was fine for years. In texts, in short calls, in the 3-sentence messages she sent me that I read and chose to accept because accepting them was easier than the alternative. And I said I was fine too, in my own way. Fine in Canada. Fine taking care of Bernadette. Fine telling myself that no news was good news and that my daughter was a grown woman and that I had raised her to handle things. We were both lying. Not to each other exactly. More to ourselves. What I know now, what this whole thing forced me to understand, is that the people who hurt Rochelle didn't create her vulnerability out of nothing. They found it. Dwayne found a young woman who had been left alone with a large responsibility and a mother an international flight away, and he made himself necessary to her, and then he made himself the only thing between her and chaos. And by the time she understood what was happening, she'd already signed things she couldn't remember signing. That's how it works. It's not dramatic in the beginning. It's slow. It's a series of small decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation, and then one day you look up and you're sleeping on a cot in the smallest room of your own house, and you've forgotten what it felt like to want something. I can't put all of that on Dwayne, as much as I'd like to. Some of it belongs to me. I gave Rochelle a house and I gave her an investment property, and I told myself that was enough. That material security was the same as the kind of security that actually holds. It isn't. What I didn't give her, what I wasn't there to give her, was the ongoing practice of trusting her own judgment, of hearing her own voice, of having someone in her corner often enough that she could remember, on a bad day, that she wasn't alone. You can't give someone 12 years of that in a single phone call. You can't wire transfer it. You can't deed it over. Rochelle had to build it back slowly, the way you build anything that's been damaged, carefully, from the inside out, with patience and without shortcuts. I watched her do it. I watched her sit across from me at that kitchen table and find words for things she'd kept quiet for years. And I watched that cost her something, and I watched her do it anyway. That's what I think of when I think about what real strength looks like. Not the absence of fear, not the performance of composure. Just the decision, made again and again, to keep going toward the honest thing, even when the honest thing is hard. What happened to her was wrong. What Twain did was calculated and cruel, and the courts agreed. What Odette did, benefiting from it month after month, was its own kind of wrong. People who take from someone who is already depleted, who treat another person's suffering as an opportunity. That kind of behavior carries a cost eventually, not because the universe is keeping score, but because it shapes the person doing it. It closes things off. Dwayne is in a prison cell now, and I don't spend much time thinking about him, but I do think sometimes about the version of himself he chose, year after year, when he could have chosen otherwise. What I choose to spend my time on is Rochelle, the consulting practice she built, the window boxes she planted, the laugh that came back. That's where I put my attention now. Not perfectly, not without the weight of what I missed, but deliberately and with both eyes open, which is more than I can say for 12 years ago.